Good afternoon. It's such a pleasure to be here in this wonderful room, in this wonderful town and this beautiful country. I was asked to speak about my life in science, and I gave it the title, A Scientist in Wonderland. And I gave it that title also because I published a book with that title, which is my memoir, A Scientist in Wonderland, a memoir of searching for truth and finding trouble. I will start with the beginning. I was born in Germany. My father, my grandfather were both doctors. I went to school in Germany and the United States. And our family doctor was a homeopath. That actually is quite important because for me, homeopathy was just medicine. My ambition was to become a musician, but I had a clever mother who talked me out of it and said, you can do the music on the side, and sure enough, medicine took over. I studied medicine. I hope you all recognized me. I'm the drummer. Back to medicine, I studied, as I said, medicine, and by coincidence, my first job was in the only homeopathic hospital in Germany at the time. The hospital still exists, and there I learned homeopathy, but also in various other occasions, I learned all these treatments hands-on, and this is what I used to practice on patients. And you may think that I was turning into a quack. Luckily, I didn't. I pursued conventional medical training in various other fields. And then I had a complete career change. I went to London and I became a scientist. I don't need to translate that. But I need to stress that as medical students, we don't really learn how to think critically. We hardly have time to think at all, but we certainly don't learn how to think critically, and this is what science brought me personally. So then I went back to my old medical school. I made a PhD. I specialized in rehabilitation medicine. I became professor of rehabilitation medicine in Hanover, Germany, and soon after, I got the chair of rehabilitation medicine in Austria, Vienna. In Vienna, it was my task to take over a team of about 20 co-workers, and we were in the traditional old hospital, which is very famous. The medical school of Vienna is very famous. And this guy is not my grandfather, but is Ignaz Semmelweis, who found out that washing hands is a good idea. And I'm putting him on the slide because I actually, as my office, when I came to Vienna, had the rooms which formerly were occupied by Semmelweis. But my task in the first 1.5 years was not so much to practice medicine in that old medical school, but to prepare my team and to enlarge it from 20 to 120, so a huge expansion, and move it into that new hospital that you see here, which had been planned for well over 50 years. And my clinic was the first one to move into that hospital. So the grand opening, I found it on the internet, was on the 7th of June, 1994. And it was a truly important event for the country. There were cameras, there were journalists, there were politicians, there was the mayor of Vienna, and all gave speeches. And because I had the first clinic in the hospital, I was asked to give a speech as well. So I had about 3 months' time to prepare for that speech, and I thought it's a good idea to go into the history of your own faculty, of your own department. I went into the libraries and I had many, many surprises. There was a huge gap in the evidence. Books had disappeared, evidence had disappeared, and when I asked, people gave me strange looks and said, you better be quiet about that. The thing that I found out that well over half, maybe even 2/3 of the medical faculty had disappeared within weeks. And the reason was that. It was the German troops taking over Austria in 1938. I also found out who became the dean of the medical faculty, the man in the middle here, Professor Pernkopf, who actually was a famous person, an anatomist, who is responsible for the most, at the time, the most popular and around the world best-selling atlas of anatomy. In these anatomical paintings, there were Nazi insignia hidden, and the models for the anatomical drawings were executed political prisoners or Jews. And the general atmosphere at the medical school in Vienna was to sweep it under the carpet, not to talk about, not to address these problems. And it created an atmosphere which I thought for myself was unbearable. And I decided not only to not give my talk on this subject, but also to leave Vienna after 4 years. I also published the whole research that I did, despite of the lacking evidence, in an article published in the Annals of Internal Medicine. And if somebody asks me today which is my most important paper ever I published, I would, without hesitation, name this particular paper. But I have to credit my 4 years in Vienna with alerting me to this important subject, which ever since has remained with me, and I have published a lot about the medicine of the Nazis and the Third Reich. But back to alternative medicine, which I call so-called alternative medicine. The terminology is very confusing. We have all these terms, but I think we all can agree that alternative medicine is the most popular one. So why do I call it so-called alternative medicine? I think it's the better term because if a therapy does not work, it cannot be an alternative. If an airplane doesn't fly, it's not an alternative for transport. And if it does work, it belongs to evidence-based medicine. So I believe that so-called alternative medicine is the better term. So in 1993, I arrived at the University of Exeter. Exeter is a sleepy town, and I thought all this excitement is behind me, and I will now learn how to sail, play golf, and do a little bit of medicine. One of the first things was that the Queen came to Exeter and expressed the wish to meet me. We did get on very well. I think you see that on the picture. However, with her son, I had my problems. In Exeter, I built up a team, multidisciplinary, linguistic and multinational, of people, researchers, doing research into so-called alternative medicine. We focused completely on research. We had no clinical duties and very little teaching duties. Our research was into many, many areas of alternative medicine, which are listed here, but our focus was on acupuncture, chiropractic, herbal medicine, and homeopathy. For the talk today, I will just briefly explore a little bit homeopathy. Why homeopathy? Because you already heard my personal background. It is also a very good example in many ways for a popular so-called alternative medicine. There's plenty of research, so we can talk about it. And it divides opinion like no other treatment. And even in Italy, you have a very active history in inventing certain types of homeopathy. So homeopathy was invented more than 200 years ago in Germany by a guy called Samuel Hahnemann. He was a doctor, and he postulated two principles: like cures like, and less is more. That may look strange and perhaps even complicated, but the like cures like principle is really very simple. Imagine yourself cutting an onion. In all likelihood, your eyes will start watering. For me, as a homeopath, this means I would treat watery eyes, for instance, allergies, with something made from onion. And the less is more principle is also easily explained. Homeopaths obviously don't use the onion pure, but they dilute it. In this graph, they dilute it by 1 to 100. Then they use that dilution, dilute it by 1 to 100, and so forth, up to a dilution that is so high that the actual product would not contain a single molecule of the onion. Homeopaths obviously know that, but they would argue that homeopaths is okay anyway, because for several reasons. It has stood the test of time, it is popular, it is approved by important institutions, it is effective, it is safe, it is inexpensive, it is holistic, and it's natural. All of these assumptions are false. They are either fallacies or they're quite simply false, and I'm going to show why that is so. This is the Berlin Wall, and you may ask, what is the Berlin Wall in a talk about homeopathy doing? The fact is that the Berlin Wall is also a homeopathic product, which you see here in the middle. Lots of people believe that homeopathy is made from plants. It is made from, as you can see here, diclofenac coffee, from electrosmog, from owl, from sunlight, from vacuum, from X-rays, from mobile phone rays, and even from coronavirus. So what is the evidence about that? The very first trial, and that is, I find very interesting because it's not well known. The first trial, the first randomized clinical trial in the history of medicine was a trial of homeopathy. It took place in 1835 in Nuremberg and was conducted by a Gesellschaft Wahrheitsliebender Männer, which is a society of truth-loving men, which is particularly funny because it implies that women are not truth-loving. The trial was squarely negative. It showed that there is no difference between a placebo and the homeopathic remedy that was being tested. The biggest program for testing homeopathy was conducted by the Nazis. In the picture, you see the World Conference in Berlin of homeopathy in 1937. In the first row, you see Himmler and Hess. and in the middle, the Congress president, they initiated a program, a vast program of testing homeopathy because they thought it would be wonderful if it worked. It was cheap, it was very German, etc., etc. The results, however, were completely and utterly negative. Despite these early negative results, homeopathy kept being tested. Here we see a clinical trial that we conducted. It was on individualized homeopathy for childhood asthma, and again we showed that there is no evidence that homeopathic remedies are superior to placebo. To date, we have well over 500 controlled clinical trials of homeopathy. So anybody who tells you that there's no data on homeopathy is not well informed. If you have 500 trials of anything, chances are that there are some positive by chance. And chances are also that homeopaths cherry pick the positive trials and show you the positive trials in an attempt to persuade you that the evidence for homeopathy is positive. But cherry picking is not very scientific. The scientific way is to rely on the totality of the evidence and to assess critically the quality of the evidence. And when we do that, we do what is called a systematic review. Here we have an example of a systematic review that we conducted, a systematic review of homeopathic arnica, which is probably the most popular homeopathic remedy. And the conclusion was that the claim that homeopathic arnica is efficacious beyond placebo, beyond the placebo effect, is not supported by rigorous clinical trials. Meanwhile, we have so many systematic reviews of homeopathy that I once decided to do the strange thing of conducting a systematic review of systematic reviews, which concluded that clinical evidence of homeopathy does not warrant positive recommendations for its clinical practice, which is a scientist's polite way of saying it's rubbish. But you may not trust me personally doing rigorous research, and certainly homeopaths don't trust me. And therefore, it is important to mention that a very independent body, namely the National Health and Medical Research Council of Australia, did exactly the same thing. They did a systematic review of systematic reviews in 2015 and concluded the evidence does not show that homeopathy is effective. Crucially, they also concluded people who choose homeopathy may put their health at risk. How come there can be a risk of homeopathy? I've told you that it doesn't contain anything, it's so highly diluted. And I've shown you this graph depicting the dilution. This is probably the most important slide of my talk today. If used as an alternative for an effective treatment, even a harmless therapy becomes life-threatening. That is best evidenced by the fact that homeopaths tend to advise parents against vaccinating children. One could therefore say that the homeopathic remedy might be safe. The homeopath certainly isn't. And we need to remember that the value of a treatment like homeopathy or any other treatment is not determined by its risk alone or by its benefit alone, but by the balance of the two. If a treatment doesn't have benefits like homeopathy and involves even a small risk, then this balance cannot possibly be positive. we have to come back to Charles. I've talked so often of him that I will make this very short. I've also published a book about him, Charles, the Alternative King, now that he's king. And I've highlighted in this slide that he once said he is proud to be the enemy of the Enlightenment. Here's one example of his being the enemy of the Enlightenment. He, to the surprise of everybody, launched on his own firm, the Duchy Originals, a detox tincture. I was asked by journalists in the UK what I think about it, and I thought that it was not evidence-based, and I called Duchy Original detox tincture the dodgy original detox tincture. But the big blow-up between Charles and myself came when he commissioned a report by this guy at the bottom called Christopher Smallwood, which was to investigate the role of complementary and alternative medicine in the National Health Service. It was a report that was not for peer review and publication. It was a report that was to be discussed and handed over to the politicians in Westminster. I was asked to contribute to this report, but I had to withdraw from it when I saw how very unscientific Christopher Smallwood was proceeding, and that he clearly had written the conclusions before he looked at the evidence. There were multiple problems with the report. For instance, homeopathy was recommended as a cost-saving treatment for asthma, even though there's no evidence. And I commented that if we integrated that into the NHS, we would kill about 200 children per year. So I withdrew from the report, but a journalist from the Times phoned me up and said, this report is about to come out, and it's on your subject. Why are you not involved? I explained that I had withdrawn from it, and I explained why I had withdrawn from it. The next day, it was on the title page of the Times with the title, Prince Plots Alternative Treatments for the NHS. With that, I had neutralized the report completely, and it was inconsequential, but I had also made powerful enemies. I received a complaint from the first private secretary of Prince Charles. Not I received a complaint. My superiors in Exeter received the complaint and were asked to look into a breach of confidence by me. What followed was 13 months of investigation by my own institution. I had to take lawyers against my own institution, a complete destruction of my department, no more funds, no more money, no more infrastructure, and my early retirement in 2012. Charles was probably delighted. The Vice-Chancellor of Exeter and the Dean of the Medical School both got knighthoods. So I was retired, voluntarily, I have to say, but retirement wasn't as quiet as I predicted. I created a blog where I have now published 2,500 articles, and I invite you to go onto this blog. I'm a columnist for several publications. I have published further original research, about 20 books. I received further official complaints via my university. I've received 2 further scientific awards, given about 50 lectures, and as I said, a few books. These are the books. I won't go into detail. You can find them all on Amazon if you want to. And I will just stress my aims with all this. Why am I doing this? Am I doing this for the money? No. Am I doing it because I have something against so-called alternative medicine? Certainly not. As you can well imagine, I was slightly even in favor of some of the alternative medicine when I started. And I'm strongly in favor of good evidence in medicine. I do it to fight misinformation, I do it to prevent harm, and I do it to further critical thinking. And there's plenty of harm so-called alternative medicine can do. I will not go into it. I usually divide it into direct harm, indirect harm, eroding values, and financial harm. And I will finish with the last sentence from my book. When science is abused, hijacked, or distorted in order to serve political or ideological belief systems, ethical standards will inevitably slip. The resulting pseudoscience is a deceit perpetuated on the weak and vulnerable. We owe it to ourselves, to those who come after us, to stand up for the truth, no matter how much trouble it may bring. Thank you. Thank you.